So I spent a lot of time sort of preparing this message. It's something I've been thinking about and working through, and I had started it a while ago, and then actually I sort of ran into a dead end in trying to put some of the pieces of it together. And I'm going to leave you in a little bit of a suspense about what this message is about until a certain point. All right, and the point where I will tell you what it's about, well, I'm trying to set up like a light bulb moment, okay? And in that moment, hopefully you can suddenly see this certain relationship like you haven't seen it before. Actually, I call this the M. Night Shyamalan effect. All right, if you're not familiar with this guy, he makes movies and
he's actually dead.
I know. And the effect is that you can see it in The Sixth Sense, that movie, right, where all of a sudden you're watching it, you don't really understand, and then all of a sudden it clicks. Oh, Bruce Willis is a ghost that doesn't know he's dead. Yeah. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. So a little bit about this teaching, though. It's a topical subject in a way, and we're going to look at several examples, and I hope to make several points throughout and about this subject, which is still a mystery at the moment. And then I'm going to try and tie them together, and then I'm going to summarize them, and hopefully we can all take a little bit of value out of it. So the first thing, the first example that I want to look at that can demonstrate my point, this example lies in the descendants of Isaac. All right, there were twins born to Rachel who were named Esau and Jacob. All right, and I'm operating a little bit under the assumption that you have a basic understanding of these two characters and the relationship and sort of how it played out. Well, the case I want to make is that we can see within these two characters a certain personality trait. And one such personality trait that if you have a high level of it, it will ultimately lead to blessings. And if you are low in it, it will cost you your blessings. And it's incredible, the Torah portion that Joshua gave, because I felt like it's just the same thing almost. A little bit of a different perspective on things, but it really is the same thing, and it goes along with what Eli was saying, what he was praying, and it goes along with what Dan was saying, and it's all connected. So that's why I'm starting with Jacob and Esau. I think they're a good example of it. And actually, what we have is the reason it's so perfect is because we obviously have this trait, right? I mentioned if you have it, you have blessings. If you don't have it, you lose blessings. And that's what we see in Jacob and Esau. So Jacob had it. Esau didn't have it. And then Jacob gained the birthright and the blessing. And I believe these two things are connected, right? We know that the story of the birthright and the story of the blessing, they're quite different. But I think they are tied through this one personality trait Jacob demonstrated and Esau did not. And in a way, you could define this topic and this personality trait as a character quality. And ultimately, that's what it is at its lower level, at its sub-characteristics. But ultimately, if you have this trait, you do have excellent character. You have all sorts of other qualities and much more. All right, so the very first scripture in our example of Jacob and Esau that sort of outlines this is Genesis 25:27. And we're going to be sort of in these first, or in 25 through 28 for the first little bit. And it says this: When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. You may ask, well, what does this tell us about their personalities? And actually, it's a lot in this little verse, right? The rabbis they do expound on this, and they describe what it means to dwell in tents. And you might think, well, it sounds like he could be lazy laying around in the tent, and he's not ambitious, but it's the opposite. Dwelling in tents, the sages tell us, equates to someone who is righteous and is studying and seeking God. It also makes us sort of think that he worked the land and was a gardener, potentially also a herdsman. And from that, and in line with what we know about gardeners and herdsmen, right, we believe that he was patient, and he had perseverance, and he understood delayed gratification. Like, wow, all that from dwelling in tents, right? I know. So Jacob knew cultivating crops was a long-term solution, right? Because it's this process, right? You till the land, you plant the seeds, you water it, you wait for the sprout. As they come up, you continue to care for the plants. You pick the produce in its season, and then you cook lentil stew. So that's where we find him a few verses later, cooking the lentil stew. And Esau, being a hunter, right, he took food when he needed it. And it was like this. And instantly, he has his meal. This is sort of an instant gratification versus the delayed gratification. And I'm not talking about modern-day hunters. Let me just dispel that right now. Like hunters, the hunters I know are conservationists, right? They care about and they receive training on herd health, population, migration, and their seasons, and there's careful planning that goes into modern hunting, right? And America has established in that way so that we don't hurt our free wild game and livestock. You can just ask Justin about these things. Actually, I think he went to college for that. And it's this mixture of applying the principle of delayed gratification and actually mixing the skill of herdsmen together with hunting. But we know Esau was partially incapable of thinking long term, and this is what actually cost him his birthright. So we're going to read a few stories and actually see that the next text, I believe, is pointing this out to us. All right, so we're in 25, we were in 27. Go down to 29. Once when Jacob was cooking lentil stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I'm exhausted." And therefore his name was called Edom. And Jacob said, "Well, sell me your birthright now." And Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is my birthright to me?" You see, he wanted what he wanted. He didn't count the cost or have the patience to wait for it. So, 33. Jacob said, "Swear to me now." And so he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate, and he drank, and he rose, and he went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So the next story, we probably know it pretty well, and this is about Jacob receiving the blessing from Isaac instead of Esau. And I'll summarize up to a certain point. So Isaac is old, he's blind, thinks he's about to die, and he asks Esau for a good meal of wild game. And after the meal, he says, "I'll give you your blessing." Rebekah overhears this plan, and she outfits Jacob with Esau's clothes, some skin to cover his arms and make him hairy because Esau was hairy. And she has him bring delicious food before Isaac, pretending to be Esau. And it works. Right? Isaac blesses Jacob with the firstborn blessing, thinking he's blessing Esau. And then Esau comes in, he learns about it, and then we have Esau's response, which I think sort of gives us a little bit more insight about his personality. So that's Genesis 27:35, if you want to flip over a page or two. And Esau, this is Isaac. Isaac says this, "But he said, 'Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing.' And Esau said, 'Is he not rightly named Jacob?'" Right? Supplanter, taking somebody else's spot. "For he has cheated me these 2 times, and he took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." And then he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" But now Esau is sort of misportraying the facts because Jacob did not steal Esau's blessing, right? Esau sold, birthright. Esau sold his birthright to him, but he claims Jacob stole it. And in fact, he doesn't take any responsibility for the position that he's now in at all. And he views himself as a pure victim in this moment. But in actuality, the situation of him being supplanted is the product of him being impatient and disobedient. In what way? All right, I found something pretty interesting about this whole story. And what's interesting is the verses that fall directly on either side of it, right? As you transition into the story, the very first verse, before you come to, and Isaac was blind and he was, well-aged. Basically, I think that's 27 verse 1. Right before you come to that, the last verse of 26 says this. Actually, I'll read the last two verses. 26:34 says, when Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Berai the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. All right. Now, we have the story of the blessing all through chapter 27, and then we have the last verse of chapter 27. And then Rebekah said to Isaac, and this is a complete shift in the whole story going into this last verse. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me? So, I don't know if you see what Rebekah's saying. Right? If Jacob marries one of these women, what good will my life be to me? In other words, I believe what she's saying is, like, all of our future was sort of pinned on Jacob, right? Because she could not count on Esau at this moment because of everything that has happened to him and what he's created, the life that he's created for himself. Esau couldn't wait and follow his parents and their advice on marriage. He just went and he picked his own wives. Two wives from the daughters of the Hittites. And I think that's kind of why she felt she had to take matters into her own hands. But we know, like, this was God's will, and these situations and this family dynamic sort of arranged it to bring about God's will. This is going to sound crazy, but I want to make the case that it was actually fortunate for Esau that this happened to him. And the text shows us this, I believe, that he had this incredible learning moment through this, losing his blessing. So go to Genesis 28:1, and let's see what he learned. Then Isaac called Jacob, and he blessed him, and he directed him. You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. So he's blessing him because Rebekah has told Jacob to leave and get away because Esau wants to kill him. So Isaac's thinking, okay, Rebekah just told me, like, this is going to utterly devastate her if we end up with more daughters-in-laws like this. So then Isaac called Jacob, and he blessed him, said, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. Go down to verse 6, and we'll see what Esau learned, hopefully. Now, Esau saw, right, and you can take that to mean that he sort of had this epiphany that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he directed him, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. And Jacob obeyed his father and his mother and gone down to Padan Aram. Esau just saw this. Wow. He just realized this was actually the way it was supposed to be done. And we have him seeing something else. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael, and he took as his wife, besides the wives that he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. So we know that God orchestrated Jacob to supplant Esau and to take his birthright, to take his blessing, and that God used Jacob's mother to do that. But that doesn't mean that Rebekah could not see that Esau was on a wrong path. He was brash, he was impatient, he was disobedient, egotistical, a blowhard, a know-it-all, and he had a lot of bad associations, and he was really bad at choosing wives. And because of that, she realized that he would almost certainly squander any blessing that he'd gotten, or use a blessing for evil purposes. At least I believe that. Right? It's debatable. Like the text doesn't say it, but that's kind of how I see Rebekah's thought process through this. So in that way, Rebekah is kind of making a logical move. And it's a great lesson to teach our kids. Right? Honor your father and mother. And there's also a spiritual truth involved around like what happens to Jacob. God works all things together for the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So I'm going to begin to uncover the purpose behind choosing this text and the ones to follow. And if you remember, I mentioned at the beginning that this sort of, we're looking for a personality trait. And personality is broken down a couple different ways, but like one of the more popular ones is the big five, right? And in the big five personality traits, you have 5 main traits, obviously. And the 5 traits are openness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, and conscientiousness. So the one that Jacob was high in and that Esau lacked was conscientiousness. Here's the definition of conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is a fundamental personality trait, one of the big 5, as we said, that reflects the tendency to be responsible, organized, hardworking, goal-directed, and to adhere to norms and rules. And if you think about that definition for a second, you realize that it sort of only describes observable physical manifestations of other particular qualities, and it doesn't really go into any emotional or mental, verbal activities. And so I think it's saying that you can tell if someone has this by the sub-characteristics that you see, these good character traits. And it's kind of in line with what Jeremy was talking about last week when he was talking about faith and how you see faith, right? Like technically faith doesn't exist unless it is exhibited by works, right? It's a concept until you see it, until you actually see it manifested in works. So you can't see it per se, but you can assess that it is there and that it exists by measuring its sub-qualities. And so this is how you can tell someone has a high level of it, by seeing them do certain physical things. The real question about conscientiousness is what causes it. So I have a favorite philosopher I listen to, and I think that we should focus so much on the Torah, but it is not wrong to listen to other people that you can be like, that person's wise, right? You'll listen to Pastor Jeremy and Joshua, and we can listen to people, explain things that we see in life and be like, okay, that's wisdom also. So I have this guy that I listen to. He's a modern day philosopher, and his name's Jordan Peterson. I've spoken of him before. He's a clinical psychologist and a professor, and he's made studying personality and these 5 traits like a major part of his life. And specifically on how these big 5 personality traits manifest in people and what kind of outcome, what each personality trait could predict in a person's life and the type of life they live and the way that they interact and the output that they have throughout their life. And he makes this claim, and this is sort of a paraphrase. He says that a high level of conscientiousness is the number 1 predictor of success within the totality of a person's life. And he extrapolates that it's not the key to like wealth or power, it's not the key to any particular thing, but in general, you will win more in life at all the various aspects, marriage, parenting, friendships, work, influence, your community, right? You will win more in life the higher level of conscientiousness that you have. And he builds on those thoughts by saying that the reason it creates success in all these different avenues is because a conscientious person will do things more appropriately, like especially long term, right, than a person that is low in this. The most basic level of explanation, they're able to see things from a different perspective than others, a longer timeline. And, the best example of that is delayed gratification. So, they'll save money. Instead of blow it, they'll prepare for the future a little bit better. And back in the early 70s, they did an experiment. Stanford College did an experiment on delayed gratification where they put 3-year-olds one by one in a room with a marshmallow on the table. Have y'all seen this? They redid it in like 2018, but I think they were trying to go for something more modern. But the 70s one really nailed it, if you read about that study. And so they tell the kids, all right, look, we're going to put this marshmallow here. We're going to leave the room for a second. Now, if you can wait until we get back, there's going to be an extra surprise. You can have the marshmallow right now, though, if you want. You can go ahead and eat it. And then they leave the room. Well, the kids that waited and could put off the temptation of that marshmallow until the return of the test administrator, they followed them 20, 30 years later, and they found like these kids were way more successful than the ones that as soon as the guy left the room went. And I'm not, so there's a lot of conventional wisdom, right? And so I'm not saying that like conventional wisdom, a bird in the hand worth two in the bush is not true. But what I would like to tell you is that I think a conscientious person with a bird in the hand will also figure out a way to get those other two bush birds. Over time, he'll get the other bush birds. So another thing, and although it may seem sort of unrelated, is that, I think I said it, right? They can see things from another person's perspective, so these people tend to have more empathy. They can react more appropriately during controversy, and therefore they're often peacemakers, and they're not bridge burners. Although I guess, I just sort of realized it just now, I guess Jacob sort of was, but Rebecca organized that blessing stealing. So, conscientiousness is not necessarily easy to nail down, right, as most non-tangible concepts are. But we see evidence of it, and we're able to define it by its evidence. And I've tried to create a simpler definition, more narrow, more focused, that doesn't use the exhibitions of actions as the same way like the dictionary definition does. And it's this. Here's my definition. Conscientiousness person's acts are based on a conscience built by a moral framework based on God's truths and natural laws. The larger and more founded this truth-based framework is, the higher your conscientiousness level is. So I have this theory. I call it a theory, but I think it's probably a fact. You can take like evident truth from history, math, science, and you can find that in the Bible, or principles of it within the Bible. And here's a really easy example. Maybe I can sort of demonstrate that with you. Imagine you have no perception of gravity. Right? For some reason, gravity just does not exist in your world, and you have no mental capacity to understand gravity. And so you can't perceive that you're being pulled towards the center of the earth. But that's what gravity is, right? It's pulling you towards the center of the earth, but you don't know it. So you walk up to a cliff, this 90-degree edge drops completely down. You have no feeling or mental capacity of gravity, then you would surmise that you could just make that 90-degree corner and start walking down on that flat surface just as well as the one that you're leaving. But we have awareness of the law of gravity, so we don't walk off the edge. Well, when you become aware of certain spiritual principles and relational principles, parenting principles, principles of friendship, you can avoid walking off metaphorical cliffs in your life. Right? And these things will lead you to a greater level of success with God and with your fellow man. So, if Esau had understood the principle of honoring his father and mother, he wouldn't have taken these Hittite women that made their lives absolutely miserable. Those, I believe, actually cost him his blessing, or we can see evidence of it. And if he would have understood the principle of delayed gratification, maybe he would have had some food stored up when he got back from hunting, or he probably wasn't about to die, and he could have just waited it and suffered through. But he was an instant gratification kind of a guy. So, if we're to take these various things that I'm mentioning here about conscientiousness, what biblical quality would you think it would most likely mirror? Like, what are we looking at? Like, there's a word. What biblical quality is conscientiousness when we think about it being in the Bible? You want to throw something out? That's a good one. It's not the one I'm thinking of. Ooh, that's really close. She said discernment. It's really close. It's really close to. That's the closest, but here's what it is, actually. I believe it's understanding. Understanding. And I figured everybody would jump at wisdom right off the bat. And it's extremely close, and all those answers are actually, they're all tied together. But wisdom is knowing the elements of God's truth-based framework, and I believe understanding is the application of that. Okay? And it's, like I was saying, it goes along with the faith and works-based rubric, right? To where you have faith and it exhibits by work. You have wisdom, you exhibit it through understanding. And so, there's this one particular book where the entire theme is wisdom. Wisdom and understanding. It pairs those all the time. It says understanding 42 times in the 31-chapter book. And it wasn't just given to give you practical steps on any one particular thing, but it's a bunch of little proverbs that enlighten us to this common theme of greater truth. And it sort of gets your appetite whet to seek out and to understand how the framework of truth works and how it's true and that it was breathed out by God. And it's a little bit like a commentary on the personality of the great author. So, the secular psychologist, they don't know. Well, actually, I think it's possible they know. They don't really say it, that this quality, which they call a personality trait, is inseparable from the law of God. King Solomon says, Proverbs 3, verse 5. Now I'm going to be in Proverbs a little bit if you want to turn over there. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. So Solomon's saying, rely on God's understanding, right? And in it you can act in accordance with the way that God views the universe. And this is what conscientiousness actually is. It's God's intended framework for life that we can learn about and then exhibit. So what happens in the next verse? Proverbs 3. If I didn't say Proverbs 3, that's where we're at. Proverbs 3:6. It says, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. So I paraphrase that a little bit like this. Rely on God's understanding. He will make your path straight and give you the pure desires of your heart. Where do I get my expounding, my extrapolation from? The next few verses. Go down to verse 13. It says, happy is the man that finds wisdom and the man that gets understanding. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things that you can desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are the ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is everyone that retaineth her. The Lord, by wisdom, founded the earth, and by understanding he established the heavens. That's a pretty incredible verse that I had to really look into to try and figure out what it meant. And I think I found the reason that Solomon makes this connection, and he's using this particular metaphor. Right? He links wisdom to the earth, and he links understanding to the heavens. So the key to this is the way, and this is my extrapolation and my opinion. I think it's a deeper truth that I've been enlightened to, and anybody is willing or welcome to disagree. But look at the way that David refers to understanding and wisdom. David calls it the works of his hands. All right, so let me show you. David says several times, like, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Psalms 8:3 says, when I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which you've ordained. Psalms 102:25, he says, of old thou hast laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thy hands. So if you look into this word understanding, right, the Hebrew word of understanding is binah, and its simplest form, right, like if you go back to its root, it's just a beyin, which is just a bet noon. Sorry, it transforms like two different times. So an older version is beyin, which is a bet yud noon, and then the original version is just bet noon, right? And I know some of you know Hebrew quite a bit. What is the word bet noon? Sun. It's sun. But it's also it is the exact word for build. Right? I think it's no coincidence, right? The vowels would just be in a different spot. And it's no coincidence that these words are the same, very close together. Because the greatest thing a human can do is partner with God in building another human, another life. Inside of the mother, God creates and builds a human. It's incredible. All right, I'm trying to stay on target. His wisdom laid the foundation of the earth. He builds on that with the works of his hands. And, I think it's a picture of God putting wisdom at the core of everything and emanating out understanding and the works of his hands. The heavens stretch forth in all directions from the earth. Unless you're a flat earther. I'm personally not. I don't really have a problem with that. I wasn't even going to mention that. I don't know why I just said that. But if our works stretch forth from wisdom, they show the maturity in the application of wisdom and understanding, which is conscientiousness, which is a conscience, which is an awareness of truth that governs us and that has been built on an immutable law of God in all of his words. So, I've mentioned the word conscience a couple times, or conscientiousness, right? And we've heard this word before, too. I'll get to conscience. But we've heard this word conscientious before. A lot of times people talk about, the conscientious objector, right? Like the person that doesn't want to go into military service because, they believe that these things would be wrong, maybe for them to use a gun. And then from that we have conscientious objectors. Somebody says, based on my conscience, I can't do that. So then we have the word conscience. Here's the definition of that. Conscience is a cognitive process that elicits emotion and rational associations based on an individual's moral philosophy or value system. So, something that we do have to recognize is that even ungodly and wicked people have a conscience that they've built. And through that conscience, they champion all sorts of horrendous things, right, based on the matter of their conscience. Perversion, transgenderism, homosexuality, all those things, right? But a conscience can be defined by whatever a person values, but conscientiousness, right, this has not devolved yet like that, right? It is still very specific and very true to moral value, Torah values, the America and the Constitution that we know based on Torah and based on truth, right? That's the reason America has been successful so far, is because the Constitution was written based on the law that God gave the children of Israel. So ultimately, a morally centered conscience is what really makes a person conscientious. And if it's well developed, it will predetermine the decisions that you make for you. It's like you don't even have to think about it. It's already done. You're like, oh, well, I know what to do here because I know the law of God. And Yeshua gave us a good example of this whenever he went to the wilderness to be tempted, and he used Scripture to overcome the temptation. Right? Satan's first temptation to him was for him to break his fast. Just turn these rocks into bread, and this can be over, and you'll be good. And he says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, which is an incredible response on like several different levels, because not only is he addressing to him, I'm not going to break the fast, like this is what the Father wants for me right now, but also he's talking about what we're talking about, which is using God's words to live by. It's talking about living by the Word of God, to shape our lives, to do right, to understand God's will. So then, I'm going to make a little bit of a shift here. There's times that it seems like the Bible doesn't necessarily speak about specific issues. You can't always find a parallel principle to know, what the right decisions are for certain things. Do I take this job? Do I stay with this job? Am I supposed to move? Do I homeschool my kids? What'd you say, Joshua? So, do I take a stand on certain issues, or do I let this one pass? Do I invest in real estate or the stock market? I don't know. There's a lot of questions we're not going to be able to answer from the Torah, and what the best solution is, at least not on our own. And it could be something really crucial too, a life partner. Is this guy or is this girl, the right one for me or for my son or daughter? And the reason we don't always know is because we have such a limited perspective in our time that we're in. We know up until this point, and we don't know the future. Right? But we have somebody that does know the future. And so, we have examples, right? Who had to make a lot of really hard choices was Moses, all right? Most of them he knew immediately, right? Because he had this morally based framework that he was operating off of. But there's a few instances where somebody came to him, like the daughters of Zelophehad, and they came to him and they're like, we're asking you for an inheritance in the land with the people. And he's like, ooh, this is not addressed. And he did not know what to say. He said, you know what, I'll be right back. He goes and he asks God. He said, God, what do I tell the daughters of Zelophehad? And God gave him case law. Moses decreed on case law right there. And that case law is specific and it's set apart, I believe, for a really important purpose. And that's why it was included later. But a lot of decisions that he had to make, they were pretty easy. Because he could just see where God was moving. Right? He just had to follow him. Right? The cloud moved, the fire moved. He's like, all right, well, this is, we have the pre-instructions on this. Let's get up. We're moving with God. Because sometimes it's not about really knowing what we need to do. It's about realizing what God is doing. Then it makes sense what you should do yourself. Then you can find peace and uncertainty. If you can understand what God is doing and the work that he is manifesting in the world, then you can make determinations. And this is his perspective, right? Because his perspective is so much bigger than our perspective. Right? We have an example of somebody that had like God's divine perspective. And this was Elisha. It's a great exhibition of having divine perspective, right? Possibly even more than Elijah, because if you remember, he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit to be on him. So how do we know he had this? It's because the king of Syria, he was trying to kill Israel. He was trying to kill the king. He was trying to take them over. And Elisha knew everything that he was doing and would go and warn them. And his plans failed because Elisha knew beforehand, because he had God's divine perspective on things. God showed it to him. So as you can imagine, this is pretty aggravating for the king of Syria. This is what it says. I'll be in 2 Kings for a little bit. Chapter 6, if you want to turn there, you can. So chapter 6, verse 11 of 2 Kings. And the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing. And he called his servants, and he said to them, will you not show me who of this is for the king of Israel? And one of the servants said to him, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. Well, the king had to get rid of Elisha, so he could conquer Israel. He realized we've got priorities here. So he sent men with horses and chariots to kill Elisha, and they had them surrounded. But was Elisha afraid? Elisha wasn't afraid. Right? He had the peace of divine perspective. Elisha's servant, though, he was shaking in his boots. So 2 Kings 6, next few, verse 13. So this is where they go in and camp around them. And the king said, go and see where he is, that I might send and seize him. And it was told him, behold, he is in Dothan. So he sent their horses and chariots and a great army, and they came by night, and they surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning, this is Elisha's servant, he went out, and behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? Absolutely panicked. And Elisha said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Understand, Elisha can see the spiritual realm and the divine perspective that was given him. And Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. God, give him some of my divine perspective. Show him reality. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots and of fire all around Elisha. Having this new perspective, God's divine perspective, completely changed the reality that Elisha's young servant was viewing. And if you face uncertainty, if you feel like Elisha's servant, become your own Elisha, or ask for an Elisha to pray over you. Ask somebody, seek advice, seek wise counsel. Ask for prayer. Ask for prayer from Pastor Jeremy, from Joshua, from Miguel, or me, and I can point you to somebody. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. I'll pray for anybody. Or talk with you. There's one more proverbial story that I want to highlight, and it's not my favorite. It's kind of sad. It's the fall of Solomon. Right, we talked about his incredible wisdom and understanding that Solomon possessed, that he was given by God, greater than anyone in history. So why did he fall into idolatry? It's hard to understand. How can the wisest person that we've been told is ever to existed fall into idolatry? I'll recap the main part of his demise. So 1 Kings 10, verse 14. This is the first verse that goes into the account of his wealth. And it says the annual income of just gold was 666 talents. That may be a clue. All right, I did the math on that. That's 50,000 pounds of gold. And that was besides all the gold that came in from traders and other sales. And we learn about the cities that he built, 1,400 chariots of plated gold and the throne of ivory covered in gold. And all the regional kings and powers, they come to him and they bring him tributes of excellent gifts year after year. In chapter 11, it tells of the women in his life. 1,000 women just for Solomon. It says they were from the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the Sidonians, and the Hittites. 1 Kings 11:2. From the nations concerning which the Lord has said to the people of Israel. So he's quoting something earlier. I believe this is from Exodus 34, where he was pre-warning them not to get involved with Baal of Peor. It says, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. But Solomon clung to these in love. It tells us they turned his heart away from God and to other gods, right? And eventually, as time went on, he built up temples and altars to all these false gods, to Shamash and to Molech and to Ashtaroth. Idolatry. And if you can view the whole saga in these 11 chapters, right? 11 chapters of 1 Kings, you see this play out. And in his youth, he's set on fire, he's serving God, he's given incredible wisdom and understanding, and he uses it to build the greatest structure the universe has ever seen. And he establishes the height of peace on earth. And in his security and in his untouchable state, he becomes complacent. And he brought in these women, and he grew close to them, and they served false gods. And his downfall was ultimately the product of success. It doesn't say he has pride or an ego, but he reached a point of success to where he didn't really think he needed God for anything. His eyes and his heart and his actions started to stray away from what was good. And in the end, God cursed him. Although he did not destroy his kingdom in his time, he did it afterwards. He said he was going to curse the generations following him, and that's what happened with Rehoboam, and it all disintegrated. We have to be wary of the influences of the world, and Solomon himself says, there's a way that seems right to a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. And he was a frog in a pot of water, and the water just incrementally got warmer, slow enough that he didn't jump out. This is a warning to us about letting our conscientiousness and our God-based framework for the decisions that we make get shifted by those around us. Ultimately, this is the same, a pretty similar key factor in what Esau and why he lost his firstborn blessing. And it's the women. It was allowing women to come in that were straying. And it's a good observation to make. Young men, listen up. Right? Ungodly women can be very enticing. Use wisdom. Look at what it cost Esau. Look at what it cost Solomon. Young ladies, right? It's the same warning to you, right? Kids, young people, watch out who you hang around with. Get your parents' input, right? If you think you might be attracted to somebody, get your parents' input. Look into the parents, look into the character of the people that your kids hang out with. God tells us that Although Solomon brought the curse over him, like it wasn't enacted on until the generations after him, so God could still be faithful to his promise towards David. All right? Parents, don't allow your moral framework to be broken to where your kids are the ones that fall away. All right, let me just recap on some of the other points that I made as I close up. Understanding is and are the actions of wisdom. True wisdom flows from the Father who has created all things. We can build a framework that we operate from through the study of God's law, both biblical and natural laws that we can see and that are written in his books, in his book. And you can start a path of wisdom, understanding, and faith and righteousness today. The number one thing that any person should do, first and foremost, is understand they must repent and believe on Yeshua, that he's the Messiah, that he offered himself for us, and he's going to finish that work. All the answers to all events in our lives may not always be evident. We have to seek, and we have to pray for God's divine perspective and for his will. What is he trying to accomplish? Right? Sometimes he's just shaping us up for the work in his kingdom that we are to do. And I'll close with just a few verses from Proverbs. I already read them. You know, some say that these verses are about wisdom. Some say it's about the Torah. I'm like, aren't they the same thing? Proverbs 3:16. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways of pleasantness, in all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is everyone that retaineth her. Amen. Shabbat shalom.